In the Marvel Universe, there tends to be more than just one version of a character, and Spider-Man is no different. However, like anyone else, Spider-Man has several counterparts that are less than savory. They're dark, they're evil, and they're twisted. Some are even cannibals. Today we'll be listing the top 10 evil renditions of Spider-Man. Number 10. Spider-Lizard. Spider-Lizard was a bizarre version of Spider-Man that appeared in 1976's Spectacular Spider-Man issues 39 and 40, and was created due to feedback from a device called the Innervator. The Innervator had previously been used to revert Curtis Connors, better known as the Lizard, back to his human form. But in doing this, Spider-Man wasn't shielded from the ray. From there, Spider-Man began to experience some pretty troublesome side effects, such as increased agitation and a lack of remorse. Because of this, he became a whole lot more violent when it came to crime fighting. In fact, while fighting Chip Martin, also known as Schizoid Man, he not only threatens to beat up the Disturbed Man, but taunts him as well. Spider-Man then almost murders him in cold blood, and then has to be physically stopped from doing so. Eventually, his rage is enough for him to transform into the Spider-Lizard, providing him with the powers of the Lizard on top of his powers as Spider-Man. Spider-Lizard went on a rampage throughout the city, and because his reptilian skin was bulletproof, which left only one option to revert Peter Parker back to himself, an antidote given to him by Curtis Connors, and once it managed to work, the Spider-Lizard was no more. Number 9. Poison the Other. Thanks to Friendly Neighborhood Spider-Man issue 3, we find ourselves with a Peter Parker from Earth 70134, who has the same storyline as the one we know and love from Earth 616. That is, until he is beaten by Morlun, an interdimensional devourer of spider-folk all across the Spider-Verse. And here Spider-Man was beaten so badly that he lost an eye and was hospitalized. Even after removing his mask, his face was ruined beyond recognition. And while Peter was in the intensive care unit, Morlun came to finish off what he started, but was interrupted by Mary Jane, who he then threw into a wall, followed by the snapping of her arm. In response to this, Peter would expend his last living breaths to attack the Devourer. However, in this instance, Peter hardly fought like Spider-Man, but more like a spider given the form of man. Now sprouting from his forearms would be these hardened bone-like protrusions he would use to pin the villain's arms. His own face then shifting to become even more disturbing, as like a feeding spider, he'd start with the head, eating away at the flesh of Morlun's face, which would eventually lead to his demise. Peter would then go on to seemingly die in MJ's arms right after. But it is thanks to What If Spider-Man the Other that this tale only becomes that much more twisted. You see, just as spiders encase their victims in cocoons to prolong their demise, so too would Peter Parker, as a figurative victim of his alter ego Spider-Man, be preserved in webbing, but in this case, for the sake of regeneration. While in the cocoon, Peter has a dream involving the Great Weaver, who offers Peter resurrection in the event that he were to accept being not only a man, but a spider as well. An offer extended to the Peter Parker of Earth 616 as well, which he accepted. However, this Peter instead decided to rip the spider spirit's head off and remain dead. But as opposed to outright dying, Peter would simply remain encased without the spider to unbind him. But now, as Peter's body inched ever closer to its ultimate demise, the Venom symbiote would sense this. The reality being that as its first host, for as deranged and contemptuous as it may be, Peter would always be the symbiote's unforgettable first love. And so it would immediately escape prison and seek him out. With Peter having refused his spider half, there was a vacancy which the symbiote sought to fill. With this, the alien parasite would begin to forcibly bond with Peter, a process which spanned several months and the changing of seasons, as to break an ironclad spirit such as Peter Parker's was an undertaking of such utterly heartbreaking physical as well as psychological torment that even the Watcher found it to be too unsettling and depressing to elaborate upon. With their newfound life and newly minted attachment with the Venom symbiote, the newborn monstrosity would find Aunt May and MJ breaking into their residence. The creature before them tried to abduct MJ, insisting that she call them Poison. When she refuses their advances, Poison would propose that they'll instead puppeteer her with their very own will, pulling the strings, providing themselves female companionship without any troublesome female impulses, intending to keep her as a plaything or keepsake as opposed to an actual person. From which point Wolverine and Luke Cage would enter the fray, only to be thrown aside and even punctured by Poison's stinger. With this display, however, Mary Jane would angrily agree to go with Poison. She would accept their terms of mental domination and all, but insisted that every day they spent together, she would make them pay for what they had done to Peter, what they had done to both of them. However, in the face of this, Poison would just leave. And that was the very last time that she would ever see them. The reason why they up and left like this is unclear. However, on the point of pursuing first loves, Poison would visit Forest Hill Cemetery and dig up the body of Peter Parker's deceased love interest, Gwen Stacy, only to then subject her to the very same process that they had previously undergone, truly molding a mate in their demented image. Number 8. Last Stand Spider-Man. Now, this version of the iconic Spider-Man is not only a man tormented, but a man out of time. This Peter Parker of the future is marred by the death of Aunt May and is substantially edgier than his original Spidey counterpart. While at her gravesite, the much older and graying Peter is met with police and is revealed to be facing charges that could constitute manslaughter. It is all too clear that this Earth's Peter is a man with a whole lot of regret and is one that has been hardened by the world he lived in. But I will admit that his costume is really unique and quite cool. It's not the typical Spider-Man suit, but more of a jacket, which adds character to this grisly rendition of Spider-Man. This dark path for Peter began with his killing of Kraven the Hunter in a fit of vengeance, which he was never able to forgive himself for. Something broke in him, and he was never able to heal from it, warping him into a totally different sort of man. He was at some point married to MJ and had a son named Ben. However, it would seem that for some reason or another, he lost MJ as well. Ultimately, this less spry version of Spider-Man, when given an opportunity to surrender himself, refuses and is shot down by high-tech police, but goes down fighting. There isn't all too much information on this hardened version of Spider-Man, but it is mentioned that he once killed Dr. Octopus by piercing his heart with his own tentacle. And speaking of Doc Ock, Number 7. The Superior Spider-Man. This evil rendition of Spider-Man involves one of his most notorious arch-nemeses, Dr. Otto Octavius, otherwise known as Dr. Octopus. Due to switching minds with Peter Parker, Doc Ock inhabits Peter's body, decides to become a superior version of Spider-Man, and then later uses his genes along with Peter's to create something almost entirely different. Octavius assumes a new identity, which leads to a double life, much like the man he is trying to emulate. In civilian life, he is known as Professor Elliot Tolliver, a charismatic young man. Meanwhile, his other persona, the Superior Spider-Man, attends to the duties that the original Peter Parker would have. In fact, you could argue that the introduction of Peter's genes and memories from when he was Peter Parker is why Octavius, in his own words, is obsessed with being the better Spider-Man. He sees this new body, this new double life, as a superhero, as a means to start over and become his true self. Regardless, he devotes himself to being Spider-Man, even going as far as to take on a cosmic being. However, his suit isn't exactly the same. Octavius upgraded it with equipment from his own lab, giving the suit a more high-tech look. Obviously, his suit has upgraded abilities such as the power to emit nerve gas from one of the spider tendrils. The suit is advanced enough to have an AI system which allows it to walk by itself. He also obtains cosmic powers from Terrax the Tamer, powers similar to the Silver Surfer, no doubt. Powers that he later stored within a device as his human host wasn't a suitable one. That aside, this version of Spidey isn't merely Octavius, it is an amalgamation of Peter Parker's DNA and Doc Ock's. In fact, with Octavius's intellect, spider bots are born. They're small, spider-shaped robots used to patrol for survivors in the wake of the fight between Superior Spider-Man and Terrax. Superior Spider-Man isn't above assisting though, as he did aid in finding those stuck in rubble, but he only did so because he believed that they deserved to be saved. But due to his genius mind, Superior Spider-Man also looks down on the people he saves, noting himself to be far more intelligent. But thankfully, this arrogance does not stop him from asking for help. With a demonic infestation, Superior Spider-Man can turn to none other than Doctor Strange despite the beef between the two. And together the duo are able to defeat Master Pandemonium. That being said, there is a certain darkness within the Superior Spider-Man. Not only does he kill Waxman, even though Waxman was in fact a serial killer, he blinded the Vulture and broke the Scorpion's jaw. But ultimately, his most notorious crime is his unmerciful killing of Massacre. Like Waxman, he is a mass murderer, but unlike Waxman or perhaps any other act of violence Octavius commits, Massacre's death is unnecessary. Massacre isn't fighting back like the Vulture or Scorpion, nor is he in the act of committing a crime like Waxman. He is already defeated, already afraid, and yet the Superior Spider-Man shoots him. That being said, Superior Spider-Man does eventually go back to who he was before, Dr. Otto Octavius, his mind now being back to the man he was prior to his meshing with Peter Parker. Number 6. Symbiote Spider-Man. Symbiote Spider-Man answers the age-old question of what if Peter Parker never severed his bond with the symbiote suit. In this universe, Earth TRN-848, Peter Parker bonded with the Venom symbiote instead of Eddie Brock. Peter's powers from the suit mimic those of Venom, but unlike Eddie Brock, he possesses the ability to use his webbing with his thoughts alone. However, this Peter is haunted by chronic nightmares about his failures in life. In fact, the dreams are so bad that Peter compares them to the nightmares he had when Uncle Ben died. This change in him is even noticed by those close to him like MJ, who remarks that he is unraveling and not sleeping like he should. And this unraveling certainly comes into play later on. While in the suit, Peter unmasks and then beats, perhaps even terrorizes Hobgoblin. The symbiote encourages Peter to kill Hobgoblin, which is the first of several violent acts the symbiote entrusts onto Peter. The suit seemingly warps the very fundamentals of who Peter is. His thinking becomes more black and white as he views villains as basically scum, while his loved ones are placed upon pedestals. He instead believes in strength for strength's sake and grows so attached to the suit that Peter feels bad when he's not wearing it. No longer is there a difference between Spider-Man and Peter Parker. There is only the symbiote and this twisted ideal of Spider-Man. The symbiote is even able to convince Peter to abandon his Aunt May to the flames of her home because of the symbiote's fear. A parasitic relationship between the two is created, which is evident when Peter learns that the suit is alive. Because it is a sentient being, he believes it deserves agency despite the fact that it is trying to severely change him and is instrumental for the atrocious acts he goes on to commit. Now, Spider-Man doesn't beat people historically nor kill them, but this unholy union between Peter Parker and the symbiote goes on to kill multiple criminals in brutal fashion. At least 11 are mentioned as dying at the hands of Spider-Man. One such notable death being Hobgoblin, as his skull was literally crushed by Peter's bare hands. This is a Peter that is drenched in self-loathing in his mistakes. He is pretty much tortured by his past psychologically. That being said, his present only brings him shame. His first reaction to Hobgoblin's death isn't remorse or some sort of massive regret for his actions, only shame that others would view him as a monster, now feeling entitled to their undying affection for all that he has sacrificed to be their protectorate. A shame that causes him to intimidate J. Jonah Jameson with physical violence. He crushes the editor's hand and threatens to break the other. His intimidation goes beyond just simple threats. He enacts methods of violence to suppress others. However, he isn't above using others for intimidation as he meets Kingpin with the severed body parts of both Scorpion and Shocker, who had been contracted to hunt him down, only to then deliver irreparable damage to the crime lord's face. Ultimately, all of Peter's misdoings accumulate to a showdown between the symbiote and Spider-Man within the Fantastic Four's headquarters. In the end, Peter Parker does conquer the symbiote and joins the Fantastic Four, as he is also found innocent of the crimes he committed, as several heroes are able to testify that the allure of the symbiote is virtually irresistible. Number 5. Ghost Spider. On Earth 11638 is the Peter Parker who is later known as Ghost Spider, not to be confused with Gwen Stacy. Due to being resurrected from hell by an alternate reality Bruce Banner, who happened to be the Sorcerer Supreme, Ghost Spider was imbued with the many souls of hell. As his moniker suggests, Ghost Spider is a mashup of Ghost Rider and Spider-Man, and presumably, he has the very same abilities as both superheroes. That being said, while he was alive as the famous hero known as Amazing Spider, Earth's 11638 Peter Parker was nothing short of a monster. He absorbed the essence of other Spideys from different universes in a bid to become stronger, something he later reflects on as an addiction. This is a Peter Parker whose Uncle Ben never died and supports his nephew's heroic endeavors, and that includes aiding in the sedation and death of his own cross-dimensional kin. After being convinced of his wrongdoing by the Spider-Man of Earth 616, Amazing Spider had his own powers absorbed, which killed him. Number 4. Zombie Spider-Man. From Earth 2149 comes a Peter Parker that was infected by a zombie plague. In this universe, the superpowered zombies retain their intelligence, however they are subject to a never-ending hunger. This very hunger is what causes Spider-Man to eat his very first victim, MJ, which he would follow up with Aunt May. However, Spider-Man is the first to notice that by not eating, the hunger fades. The zombie virus changes Peter's appearance to a more emancipated, corpse-like look. His teeth are exposed as he is lacking lips, and his skin becomes more gray in color. He is also able to not feel pain, despite having broken his leg so badly it is hanging off. While his zombified peers are concerned with finding more food, Peter himself is horrified by his actions, and this is what sets him so apart from the other zombie metahumans. In fact, Spider-Man is so affected by his own actions that he continues to wear his tattered mask because he cannot even face his own reflection. Like other Spideys on our list, he is a man tortured by the atrocities he commits. When he visited an alternate Earth unaffected by the zombie outbreak, he managed to save the Mary Jane and Harry Osborn of the world from the Sinister Six, only to then inadvertently spread the zombie virus onto the Six, who would ultimately bring about a far more horrifying scene. Shamed by this, by the realization that he could never be normal again, Zombie Spider-Man tore off his own skin and tossed it in a garbage can. This Peter would even go as far as to continue making jokes, remarking that it is the only way to keep his belief that what they are doing is wrong. Due to eating Silver Surfer, Zombie Spider-Man also gains the power Cosmic. And alongside this, it can be assumed that he also retains his original Spidey abilities, but later on, he uses his arteries for mobility instead of his webbing. Zombies in this universe do not feel pain, but Spider-Man does when he uses his arteries like this. In addition to his iconic Spidey sense, Zombie Spider-Man also has something that he dubs Zombie Sense, which allows him to sense people. After consuming Galactus, Zombie Spider-Man joins other zombies to infiltrate other worlds. 40 years after eating Galactus, Spider-Man, along with others, made their way to a dimensional travel device Iron Man had previously built. In this new world, Peter Parker is still determined to do good, to save his soul. And so he attempts to create a vaccine for the zombie plague. Eventually, the vaccine is placed into Sandman's body through nanomachines, which are then used against the zombified Avenger. He dies with them, having finally avenged Aunt May and MJ. Number 3. Patton Parnell. Patton Parnell, a Peter Parker variant from Earth 51412, was a rather disturbed young man. He was torturous towards animals, regarding even his neighbor's pets as test subjects for his sick experimentation, and would peep on his next door neighbor, Sarah Jane, with binoculars through her bedroom window, even going as far as to plot on stealing so-called samples from her room. And unlike most on our list, Patton Parnell takes the moniker Spider-Man rather literally. Similar to Peter Parker, Patton was bitten by a radioactive spider while on a school field trip. His body begins to mutate from the bite, beginning with webbed fingers. Oh, and unluckily for Patton, his uncle was very much still alive. His abusive Uncle Ted, that is. And he would beat Patton so viciously that the neighbor Sarah Jane was able to hear it all. Eventually, Patton would begin to develop an insatiable lust for blood, his first meal being a rat caught in a trap beneath the fridge. He would then upgrade to a neighbor's pet cat. At this point, he didn't need glasses anymore and was capable of producing webbing from his very own body. The more he ate, the more powerful he'd become. And in only a few hours, he would accumulate quite the stockpile of animals to feed upon. However, his first human victim would be his good old Uncle Ted, who had taught him that with great power comes a great appetite, as his face was now like that of an arachnid monster. When Patton went to school, he only saw his peers as cattle. Here, he would attempt to suppress his urges by consuming a pigeon whose liquefied tissue he'd liken to the taste of a delicious milkshake. From there, he'd devour a school bully named Gene and later abduct a neighborhood kid who was searching for his lost dog, which had also been eaten by Patton. Now, after a bit of research, Patton would discover that the spider he had been bitten by was one that transfers its eggs by way of a bite. And so with that knowledge, he would invite Sarah Jane over, kiss her without consent, and then bite into her neck. From there, he would chase after her like something straight out of a horror film, as he would reveal his true self. In his room was not only the neighbor kid, but also his now stripped and bound Uncle Ted, who was also a carrier for Patton's innumerable spider children that would grow and move within the man before bursting out from within. In the end though, Patton is killed and consumed by the dimension-hopping Morlun, but that does not save Sarah Jane from her fate of carrying Patton's children. Number 2. Dark Spider-Man, the Sinister Spider-Man. Next is McDonald Gargan of Earth 616, more famously known as the Scorpion. Like many others, Gargan eventually bonded with the Venom symbiote, becoming more ruthless and more powerful than he was ever before. Thanks to the symbiote providing him the powers of Venom on top of retaining his Scorpion abilities, he was no longer a B-tier threat and was now even more powerful than Eddie Brock with the symbiote. And just like the other many hosts of the Venom symbiote, this one is quite the violent brute indeed. In fact, while fighting Spider-Man alongside the Sinister 12, Gargan tells Spidey that the supervillain group will carve their names flames into his corpse and hang him from the nearest flagpole. This iteration of Venom is especially known for eating people, even going as far as to demand a Skrull change into Spider-Man before consuming it. Now, when Norman Osborn assumed control over the Avengers, he had some medicine specially made for Gargan, who at this point simply went by Venom. Medicine designed to preserve Venom's powers while also reverting his appearance to be that of Spider-Man's black suit visage. And it is from this point that he would be the Amazing Spider-Man of Norman's New Avengers. And in this time, Dark Spider-Man, or the Sinister Spider-Man, would only become increasingly deranged and violent, devouring limbs and even people in the midst of combat. He also wasn't the most humble or bashful of protectors. After defeating General Wolfram, who had just robbed a bank, he not only took some of the money for himself, but also ate the guy's arm. He then spent said money on a stripper, killed her after he had his fun, and planted her body in Mayor J. Jonah Jameson's bed. When a bunch of villains came to attack him simultaneously, unlike Peter Parker, Dark Spider-Man devoured most of them, ate their leader's appendages, and then handed the scraps over to the police, as the survivors were now too traumatized to ever pursue him again. And all the while, he was having a whole lot of fun. Number 1. The Spider. The Spider is a rendition of Spider-Man that is a mashup between Peter Parker and Deadpool's humor. However, he is just as, if not more menacing than all the other Spideys on our list. This Spider-Man comes from Earth 15, having fused with the symbiote Carnage. Like others in Weapon X and the Exiles, he is tasked with repairing broken links within the space-time continuum. Instead of the Spider-Man moniker, this Peter is simply known as the Spider, and he shares the same powers that Cletus Cassidy from Earth 616 had as Carnage. And boy is he ruthless. Described to be a psychotic killer, the Spider had no qualms with killing a child David Richards, who is destined to become the most powerful mutant in his reality. In fact, he revels in hurting others. This is further seen when he delights in a mission the Time Broker assigns to them, which is eliminating all remaining mutants in a universe that has not only Magneto, but his M asteroid as well. The Spider's bloodlust is only shown further when he asks if he can kill random humans to make up for not being able to kill all the mutants. Not only does this Spider-Man crave violence, but he treats it like something he must do. As said before, he shares a similar macabre sense of humor, such as when he threatens to stab the Scarlet Witch, referring to it as giving her a few new piercings. But at his core, the Spider is still a madman. In his universe, he was sentenced to 67 consecutive life sentences, although what he did to garner such capital punishment, we'll never know. However, one may only presume it to be a whole slew of heinous crimes against his fellow man. Murder in and of itself is nothing new to the Spider, considering he is a convicted killer. That being said, he also fatally stabs the Vanquisher without a second thought, as if it was a casual thing to do. Regardless, he isn't a man without some loyalty. When the Hulk and Firestar turn on Hyperion, the Spider uses his webbing to stop the Hulk from punching Hyperion again, presumably engaging in combat with him. Later on, he forms an alliance with the now very unstable, if not insane, Hyperion. But beyond his acts of violence against others, Earth 15's Peter Parker also mocks his victims. This is seen when he taunts a restrained and badly wounded Firestar, branding her a loser. Not only this, but he also asks her what it's like to eat her own arm. However, Firestar does get her revenge when she uses a massive blast of her powers, which scorch the psychotic murderer known as the Spider to death. Spider-Man is an incredible hero and truly one of the best for a multitude of reasons. Yet, if he were to ever use his powers as a destroyer, he would be just as effective in ruining lives as he is at saving them as a hero. This is our very first video on the channel, and hopefully you guys can appreciate the content enough to look forward to more by subscribing with notifications on. Because now, when it comes to bringing you some of the best comic content on the platform, Plot Armor has you covered. I have been your host, Slice of Otaku. Thank you all so much for watching and have an awesome day. I love you.